Now. Okay, well, welcome everyone. And we're going to roll into talking about how we can support your EDI journey today. I want to begin by sharing an acknowledgement of the territories that I'm coming to you from today, which are those on the west coast of the Coast Salish peoples and home of the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich nations. And it's a gorgeous sunny day here, and I plan to get outside to walk my doggo a little bit later and just really appreciate the ocean and the mountains that are on these beautiful territories. And I feel like it's my responsibility to continue to learn about these territories, to learn about the histories and the stories of the peoples that live here, and to really respect and appreciate the stewardship of these lands. And today I'm also wearing some earrings that are made by an Indigenous artist locally. And so I also looked at how I can support the Indigenous makers that are part of this territory. So we're going to start with a little intro from our team. So we have a couple of team members on today, so I'm going to welcome them in. For those of you that I haven't had the opportunity to meet, my name is Andrea Carey. I identify using the pronouns she, her, hers, and elle, and I am a white cisgender woman. I already identified the territories that I am an uninvited settler on. I also grew up as an uninvited settler on Ktunaxa territories in the East Kootenays of British Columbia, and have been leading this company of Inclusion Incorporated over the last few years, and really grateful for the incredible team we have that are part of our journey together. I also identify as non-disabled, neurotypical, and I am a brain tumor survivor, so I did have some episodic disabilities related to that as I was navigating that. And I am a mom to an 11-year-old little human who is on a ice hockey journey. So we are navigating being hockey parents these days. So I'm going to throw next to Andrew Paris. Andrew, come on in.
Thank you, Andrea. It's great to see some familiar faces. My name is Andrew Paris. My pronouns are he, him, and il pour nos amis en français. I am an uninvited settler in Mi'kma'ki, commonly known today as Nova Scotia. I am a cisgendered Black man, and prior to my time here at Inclusion Incorporated as the digital media and inclusion specialist, I've had the pleasure of working for the last 17 years or so in various different positions within community, provincial, and national sport organizations.
Super. Thanks so much, Andrew. I'm going to throw to Ava next.
Thanks, Andrea. Hi, folks. My name is Ava Boschniak. My pronouns are they, them, and I'm an uninvited settler living, working, and playing on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape-Wauk, and Attawandaron peoples. Here at Inclusion Incorporated, I am the manager of inclusion projects. I'm also non-disabled and white, and I'm a trans non-binary person as well. I hold a couple of degrees in the sporting realm, one being kinesiology, one being sociocultural aspects of sport and physical activity, and I also have experience working with a wide variety of sport organizations.
Thanks, Ava. I'm going to invite Laura to share next.
Hi, folks. I am sitting in a cafe, so in flat. I'm sorry about that. My name is Laura. I use she, her pronouns. I identify as a Two-Spirit member of Pikwakanagan First Nation and mixed Indigenous Scottish German descent. I'm currently sitting on the Three Fires Confederacy land, which is in Barrie, Ontario. And I approach a lot of this work from that perspective, but also as someone who is neurodivergent and also an acute intergenerational and trauma survivor. I was a coach for about 16 years, mostly in swimming, but also alternate frisbee and triathlon. And love sport in so many ways, but I left it for a little bit because of the culture, the space. It was difficult, and I'm happy to be able to come back to it and do this work to try to make it so that folks like me stop leaving, basically. So thank you very much.
Amazing. Thanks, Laura. So I know we have several NSOs, a few MSOs on here, and some folks that are at other levels of the sports system. So we'd love for you to put in the chat who you are and where you're calling in from today and the organization that you're with. And if you've got questions throughout the session, you're welcome to put those in the chat. You can send those as a private message to us or make it public, whatever's comfortable for you. Our format for today is to do a little bit of an orientation about some of the topics around equity, diversity, inclusion, just to give you a bit of an orientation about what we're talking about. Then we're going to share some examples of some work that we've been doing in the sports system. And then we're going to talk very specifically about some of the pieces in the Sport Canada application that's currently open, to just share sort of how and what some of those supports might look like for you. And then we are going to just open it up to Q&A, and we'll stop recording at that point as well, so that that can give you an opportunity to ask something that you might not want shared post this session to some of those folks that couldn't make it. So hopefully that works for everyone, and we will start meandering through that content. So thanks for already throwing some of those pieces into the chat. So really what we're here to talk about today is about humans, and we operate in a sports system that is full of lots of different people doing lots of different amazing sports across this country. And what we've recognized is that those sports systems were built for and by certain populations. And as we go forward, part of our challenge is to understand who is part of the sports system, who's not part of the sports system, and to start to create more intentionally programs and services that support the diversity of who is Canada. So we have this opportunity in front of us to kind of grow and evolve. And so we love to root our work in this quote by Maya Angelou of do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. And so our invitation to each of you to join us on that journey of continuing to do better as we move forward in our future state. So really what we're talking about is about that topic of diversity, inclusion, and belonging. And we look at, and we will talk about equity very specifically as well as we go through, but diversity is really about who people are. Inclusion is about what they need to be successful, and belonging is about how they feel when they're part of those systems and structures and can be their complete selves. So one of the things to consider is how rapidly our demographics in Canada are shifting. And so when we think about diversity, recognizing that we really do have pretty diverse representation across Canada, and that's going to grow substantially over the coming years. Canada, as many of you may be aware, has an immigration policy that's looking to welcome about 500,000 newcomers to our country each year as we go forward. We welcomed 450,000 newcomers last year. So that's shifting the demographics of our communities in very substantial ways. We've also started to recognize that in our latest census data, we're recognizing and acknowledging that gender is not binary. And so we're starting to appreciate how non-binary and gender non-conforming and gender fluid folks are showing up in our programs, and having to think about how we support that in very different ways than we've typically set up our sport programs. Across our disability population, about 22.3% of the population identifies as having a disability. This is data from 2017, and we know that we have an aging population. People tend to age into disability. We also, prior to the pandemic and during the pandemic, and as we go forward, we're acknowledging and recognizing and mental health in a very different way, and appreciating that more people are navigating mental health issues than ever before. And so that's also going to impact our rates of disability. And we also know that different populations have different rates of disability. So while we have limited data on Indigenous populations, the data we do have suggests that about 32% of our Indigenous peoples have a disability. So that's a consideration in terms of how we're programming as well. In terms of Black, Indigenous, and persons of color in Canada, about 5% of the population identifies as Indigenous. and about 26% identify as persons of color from a range of different backgrounds, races, and ethnicities, and thinking about sort of how that impacts our programming and how we need to plan for that as we go forward. And again, that's another area that's going to grow and evolve very substantially as we welcome more newcomers to our country. So when we think about types of diversity, we recognize that we've spent a lot of time the last few years really looking at demographic diversity, which is a really important aspect of diversity. And that looks at areas around race, gender, ethnicity, but that is not the only type of diversity. So we need to continue to recognize some of the other aspects of diversity as well, such as life experiences, which is more about how we each grew up or were raised, some of the hobbies we have, our education, our work experience, languages we speak, places we visited. And then the third area is around cognitive diversity and thinking about how we each show up and process, think about, respond to the different pieces that are coming at us. And so every one of us is going to have a different way that we process and have cognitive diversity. So those different types of diversity come together to create an intersectional experience. And intersectionality is a term that was coined by the Black feminist Kimberly Crenshaw, and it's to look at how our different identities overlap and intersect to either lead to opportunities or barriers in our experiences in the systems and structures that we're part of. So appreciating that each of us is going to bring those different aspects of diversity in terms of who we are, and that's going to impact how we're received and how we're experiencing different programs and services. So something to think about in terms of how we're planning is sort of who people are and how they're being perceived in the world and how we're setting them up to be successful as we map forward in programming. If folks have questions throughout, don't hesitate to throw those in the chat too. I just want to welcome you to do that. So when we think about our sports system and recognizing why sport isn't more diverse, we, as I said at the beginning of the presentation, recognizing that traditional systems are not designed for a lot of people. And as we start to kind of challenge that and evolve that, we appreciate that at different points there's going to be, I'm going to say, some resistance to that. And so we have to continue to push that resistance to make those changes, to build more inclusive programs and services. But that's not going to be an easy task in some cases. So thinking about sort of how we need to show up and really build this forward. And there's so much opportunity right now and so much appetite to think about how we do things differently. We have a question about a copy of the recording. Yes, we will be sending out the recording after the session, as well as some resources, which will come to you tomorrow. So we really exist in a system of systemic exclusion in sport, built by and built for certain populations, and recognizing that this is our opportunity to really challenge those systems and structures, and that sport has a bit of a journey ahead of us to do that work. But we are navigating racism, sexism, ableism, elitism, ageism, homophobia, transphobia, and Islamophobia, and many others in terms of what people are navigating to be part of our sports system. And so recognizing, naming, and thinking about how those show up is going to be an important part of each of your journeys as leaders in this, and each of the sports to think about what that means for them and how we create different pathways forward. What we see in terms of how this shows up, and this is where it really starts to intersect with the safe sport discussions that so many of us have been a part of over the last few years, is that there's this pyramid of harm. And at each level of this pyramid, if we accept the behaviors that are happening there, then it kind of paves the way or allows for that next layer or next level of harm to take place. And so at the bottom of this pyramid, it's around attitudes and beliefs. So that's where racism, sexism, ableism, transphobia, ageism, et cetera, show up, and where we have feelings of superiority for certain races, genders, and thinking about sort of how at that point it's so important to really humanize each experience to counteract that. If we don't, then it allows for things like microaggressions to start to take place where people start to make comments, whether intentional or unintentional, that are around exclusion, around people's identities. And this is where we start to see some of those discrimination, harassment type behaviors taking place, which build on each other in terms of verbal expressions of slurs, violent language, bullying, and harassment. That then, if that continues, moves into physical expressions of either physical or sexual assault. And ultimately, at the top of that pyramid is things like murder, suicide, genocide, which we have certainly seen in our histories and in some of our current political climate as well. So that intersection between safe sport and DEI is really about, well, on the DEI side, thinking about how we prevent some of those behaviors from taking place, how we create space for each person to show up very intentionally for folks from equity deserving groups to be part of our sports system and to have a safe, welcoming, and supportive environment. And on the safe sports side, that response side, if we are getting those complaints, how we're really centering and protecting the person that's coming forward and coming together to recognize those abuses, that power dynamic, and to start to counteract that while empowering the individual that's come forward. So at the center of that, if we were to put those two circles, those two areas together, thinking about how we create participant-centered programming and services, how we focus on changing some of the systems and structures that exist, and how we really focus on safe opportunities, and when an incident occurs, safe reporting and advocacy to support folks. So that leads us to really focusing on systemic inclusion and how do we build that? How do we build a place and a space for each person and all of their diversity to show up and to be part of our programs? And if we do that well, it will lead to more diverse participants recognizing and appreciating that this is a space for them and wanting to be part of those programs and services. So when we look at that, it's thinking about how we're celebrating and acknowledging people's uniqueness and diversities and creating places that encourage that versus erasing people's identities and kind of ignoring those differences. So thinking about sort of what does that look like for you in your programs, in what you're doing as an NSO to really build the capacities, the understanding, the cultural competency, the awareness of how we support each human. So that brings us to thinking about equity and that not each person is going to need the same supports to be successful. So in this graphic, we've got kind of the difference between equality on the left-hand side and equity on the right-hand side, and thinking about how equality is giving each person the same thing and expecting them to be successful. And from this graphic, you can see that depending on where people are at, that's not necessarily going to serve or support them. And on the left or right-hand side, sorry, we've given people different levels of supports in those boxes to then be successful in that experience. And so for you as NSO leaders to think about what would equity look like in the context of your sport to help build those supports in to create the opportunities for people to be a part of the program. And that's really going to also come back to consultation, engagement, connection with different communities and relationship building to understand what those areas are, those supports that are needed are, and to, I'm going to say co-create or build that with those individuals and communities. So we look at this as a bit of a continuum, thinking about how we recognize diversity, we welcome diversity into our programs and services, we create the safety for people to show up as they are, we engage them, and that will lead them to committing to be part of our programs and lead towards that feeling of belonging. So we have a little video from Brené Brown about belonging. So I'm just going to play that as a little primer for moving into the conversation about belonging.
Belonging. We're wired for love. We're hardwired for belonging. It's in our DNA. But let me tell you what belonging is. The opposite of belonging from the research is fitting in. That's the opposite of belonging. Fitting in is assessing and acclimating. Here's what I should say, be. Here's what I shouldn't say. Here's what I should avoid talking about. Here's what I should dress like, look like. That's fitting in. Belonging is belonging to yourself first. Speaking your truth, telling your story, and never betraying yourself for other people. True belonging doesn't require you to change who you are. It requires you to be who you are. And that's vulnerable.
Okay. So yeah, really thinking about sort of how we support people to be who they are, not have to change who they are to fit into our programs and services. So that opportunity to create those spaces and places that support each person to show up and be supported. But we have some pieces that we need to navigate that I'm going to say are uncomfortable as we go through that. So thinking about power and privilege is a really important part of our journey in this, and recognizing that in this wheel of power and privilege that I'm sharing, we each hold a range of different identities. And in some places, some of us are going to be closer to the center of power and privilege, and some of us are going to be farther away. And so our own self-reflection in terms of where we show up and hold power and privilege, or where we're farther away from that and facing more barriers in our different identities, but also recognizing what that means for the folks that are around us, whether that's our staff team, our board, and thinking about how that shows up, as well as our participants. So an opportunity to think about what do we need to do to support the different identities that are part of our sport ecosystem, and the folks that maybe aren't part of our sport ecosystem yet, what we need to do to shift some of those dynamics in order to create the opportunity for people to be part of it. And that we exist in a sport system that's full of power structures. And those power structures are always going to be uneven in different ways, but we need to recognize that and appreciate the impact that has on people's ability to come into our system, to stay in our system, to have voice at times when things maybe aren't going well for them, and feel comfortable in having that voice. Because anytime someone brings forward an issue, they're putting themselves, and they're in a lower power structure dynamic, that puts them at risk. And that we need to, when those things come up, that we need to really listen and learn and have constructive dialogue about how we support that, because if we deny that experience, it causes additional harms. So this opportunity to really think about how we see each person, we hear each person, we understand each person, and we support each person to be part of our program and service. And that comes across both in our participant levels, in our staff, and in our boards as we go forward. So kind of circling back to thinking about this work is really about recognizing diversity, appreciating how we support inclusion by creating the supports that people need to be part of our programs, and leading towards that cultures of belonging where people can feel they can be themselves in those environments. So I'm going to pause here, see if folks have questions, and then we're going to talk about some supports that we've been working on with the sport system, and then we'll talk about the Sport Canada application. Any questions? Okay, I'm going to keep rolling. Feel free to pop anything into the chat that comes up for you, and then we'll open up a Q&A, as I said, at the end. And I appreciate that was a lot of info very quickly. We do a whole range of workshops and trainings that support going deeper on each of those topics, but wanted to give you kind of a high level of what we want you to be thinking about in this space. So thinking about this opportunity around creating a plan for your organization and what that might look like, we look at an inclusion action plan in a few different phases. So thinking about sort of what is that strategy, that vision, that mission of where you want to go in this work, how that connects to your corporate strategy, but really thinking like, what is that commitment or vision that you're anchoring this work in? From a strategy development side of things, what are some of the goals that you're going to work towards? And then as we build out your plan, we're looking at the actions that will support your success in that. And we really anchor that in data and metrics. So we're going to share with you today a couple of data points that we collect as we work with organizations. We like to talk about governance as well, thinking about sort of how this connects to your governance structures, who's going to be accountable for this work. Is there a committee or a task force that's going to help drive this work with you, and how you're going to continue to move it forward over the longer term, because this work of equity, diversity, inclusion is not short-term work. We've gotten here over literally generations, and it's going to take time to move some of this work forward. There's many things that you can do on the shorter term, but many of the pieces of work are going to take longer term to really move the dial. I'm going to say one of the areas that we find the greatest change can happen quickly is on policy. So we'll talk a little bit about some examples of that in a minute. And then really thinking about the leadership that needs to be in place for this and the trainings and supports that leaders need to move this work forward. So in that, as I just mentioned a moment ago, lots of trainings and resources, but also thinking about like what skills, and I'm going to say mostly soft skills, are needed to help drive this work and to stay true to where the organization wants to go in this work. And the next area is around systems and mechanisms. So thinking about what are some of those pieces that happen in the organization at kind of that operational level, those daily pieces, how do we really embed this into kind of the culture and the operating processes of your organization? And then there's a whole piece around support and mentorship. And so many of the organizations we work with, they have a plan, they have an implementation approach, and then it's sort of like, what are those things that pop up that they need help navigating? What are sort of those ongoing challenges that we're facing that we need help with as we go forward? So kind of thinking about how we create maybe a cohort, and I'm going to just kind of prime a piece. We're in conversations with Carolyn, who's on the call today, thinking about how we maybe bring folks together for some ongoing conversations to support this work. So overall work, we recommend that you really understand what your current state is in equity, diversity, inclusion through kind of an audit type process where you're walking through some of your data points, you're understanding a bit more about who's in the organization, where the state of some of your policies are, and thinking about what some of the existing processes and operations are that might be helping or hindering your equity, diversity, inclusion journey. We then recommend kind of building knowledge and through training so that people have a common understanding about what we're talking about, and that they're then building on their skills to move this work forward. And then developing that strategy and action plan. There's probably a fourth piece to that as well in terms of that actual implementation and what supports might be needed there. But this is thinking about sort of how we start to map that forward. So in the understanding of current state, we deploy a tool called the belonging metric, which looks at demographics of staff, board, and committees. You have the option to add participants to that as well. We have 2 different tool deployments we can do with you. And then it also works to understand the experience of each person in the organization. So we have a series of questions, and I'm going to share some examples in just a moment, that looks at how people are feeling about their experience in the organization. And where possible, with depending on numbers, we try and do an analysis to look at, are different identities having different experiences across your organization. On a policy review, really thinking about how your policies are impacting who's included and who's excluded. And so we'll share an example of that in a moment. And then looking at some of the national influences. So safe sport has obviously been a huge, I'm going to say, disruptor in our system, but also an opportunity for us to start to unpack how people are experiencing the organization and what some of the systems that we've responded with and how those are showing up for folks. Gender equity is another huge national influence in thinking about sort of how we're supporting the diversity of genders across the organization and with participants. Anti-racism, and then I'm going to add in the new code of governance code as well as another piece that really needs to be planned for as you go forward in this work. So the belonging metric, as I said, is an online assessment tool that gives you information about demographics and their experience. We deploy it with a partner called Bingo Impact Management, and it asks demographic information around age, gender, disability, race, country of origin, languages spoken, and gives us some really great information about who's across the organization. Also a great tool in terms of some reporting metrics back to funders to be able to map that year over year to understand who's part of the organization and how that's shifting. And then we also ask a series of questions related to experiences. So we look at, there's 7 categories, and we ask people to the extent they agree or disagree with the range of questions in each of those 7 categories. So those range of categories are around belonging, culture, expression, fairness, fear and psychological safety, respect, and trust, for a total of 49 questions over those areas of experience. So this is from one of our clients, not in the sports system, looking at some of their demographics. So we have those questions around age and then moving into gender identities and then moving into whether they identify as part of the LGBTQI2S community, whether they have a disability. And then there's sort of a next level of question connected to learn a little bit more about how some of those experiences are showing up for them. We also have questions around race and ethnicity, Indigenous self-identification. So we get a really good overview of what the demographics across the organization are. And then, as I said, we move into those questions around experience. So here's a couple highlight slides from those experience questions. The slide deck's usually about 80 pages long in terms of the analysis of the data. So it's a lot of data that you'll get back. But thinking about, these are some of the top ranked questions. We do an analysis on top experiences in terms of agreement and also bottom experiences. So it gives you a really a highlight around where you're doing well and where you need to pay more attention. Question around legalities around the ability to ask these questions in data and metrics. So all of the questions have an option for people to respond or to choose not to respond. So it's all self-driven and you don't have an obligation to answer any of the questions. All of the responses are anonymized. The way we run the analysis as well, as I stated earlier, while we lay out all the demographic information that we've received, in terms of people's experience, the way we do the analysis is that we won't analyze a group's experience if we don't have more than 10 people identifying from that group. So that creates anonymity in terms of people's experience as well. And then we do find that year over year, as people redeploy, it's building trust in the data because it's shared. We encourage organizations to share it back to the folks that answered it so they can start to understand how that data is being used to help inform decisions the organization's making. Hopefully that answered that question, but feel free to pop more in. So here's another kind of layout in terms of some of the data that we get back from the belonging metrics. So overall, we can see out of a total points of 7 levels of agreement around people's experience around respect, belonging, expression, fear and psychological safety, culture, fairness, and trust. And we would have slides that talk through each question and the types of responses we got for each question. That then summarizes into this, and then we would go into that analysis of different experiences. So in this case, we have a gender-based analysis. We didn't have enough responses to, as I said, keeping that anonymity of folks that identified as genders outside of man or woman in this data analysis. So we've just got that ranking between man and woman as a comparison, but you can see in this data that almost entirely across the board, men are having a better experience at this organization. And so it gives us an understanding that those experiences are different across that different identity. So some highlights around the belonging metric is that it is a piece that can be redeployed with your organization year over year or every 2 years to help track out on both your demographics and if the changes you're making are showing up in people's experiences. So we're getting some really interesting data in terms of some of those clients that have done those redeployments. And it's deployed by our partner at Bingo Impact Management. So that data is third party, which does give people a greater degree of safety in terms of how they answer, because they know that you're not directly getting that information back. So that increases the response rates, and it's built on internationally validated questions. So it's been very thoughtfully put together and can also be used as a reporting tool for funders. So here's a policy review example, and this is from a client that we worked with over the last year, and it's a support for nursing mothers policy. And so in this policy, what we do in our policy reviews, and Ava, who's on the call, leads that in our organization, is we look at what are the different policies across your organization, which ones have an EDI implication, and where are there gaps as well if you're missing a policy. And then we provide a multi-page report depending on how many policies we review. It's often between like 20 and 70 pages that goes through what is the policy, what are some of the clauses in the policy that that we would suggest evolving, and what's the recommended change there. So in this policy is a nursing mother's policy. It was very gendered and assumed that it was a nursing mother that would be in need of this, and didn't really take into consideration other caregivers, and thinking about sort of how it can evolve from this to a chest feeding policy that's more inclusive of the different folks that might be parents in that environment or caregivers in that environment. In terms of training, we work with you to understand what some of those training needs are. Sometimes it's, I'm going to say, kind of more general training in terms of understanding what diversity, equity, inclusion is. Sometimes it's very specific into topic areas. Some of the trainings that we're really focusing on with clients right now are things like trauma-informed practice, or thinking about trust and psychological safety. So diving into some of the areas that we find are really surfacing in our environments right now, and in how people are showing up and how we really support that leadership in those environments. But we have a whole range of trainings around disability, around Indigenous inclusion, anti-racism, gender inclusion. We do one around policy and thinking about how to apply policy. So large range of opportunities there. So then we move into thinking about sort of what are some of those opportunities in your strategy development. Softball Canada was one of our clients last year and said we could share this with you. So this was their vision of that their working group came up with, and that was part of their strategy. And so that's one of the pieces we work with you on, is identifying what is that commitment or vision you want to create in your organization, and using that as an anchor point to build out your strategy. We then move into thinking about what are some focus areas that we want to build the strategy under. And so this was an example from snowboard in terms of the focus areas that they chose. And then we build out those strategic pillars and goals. And so this is from Sail Canada. And they had a goal around, or a pillar around accountability, one around education, one around supportive networks, and one around programming. And these were some of the goals that showed up. And then they subsequently have an entire action plan. So these are some of their high-level actions, but they would be much more micro actions under this in terms of how it moves forward. And then we've helped them prioritize and put accountabilities to how the work's going to move forward. And so we've been working with Sail Canada for about 2 years and are working on implementations with them these days because they already have their action plan. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a view of some of the things that we're doing to support sport organizations. And so now thinking about the Sport Canada opportunity and some of the ways that we might be able to help you navigate that. So there's 2 kind of focus areas in that grant application. And so thinking about the first one, the first kind of pillar under this initiative was around policy development, renewal, and web publication. So in this, we would propose doing a policy review and renewal process with you to evolve your policies. Then there's an action plan component, an implementation and evaluation plan. And so we would develop an action plan similar to what we just shared with you, both that kind of high level strategy, but then those actions that fall below it, and as well look at evaluation metrics that would be supportive for you to move this work forward. And then the last one under this area of this initiative was the recruitment, development, and implementation of recruitment strategy, succession plan, and evaluation resources for your board of directors and leadership. And so here we would look at a board governance review and recommendations, help support recruitment approaches, skills matrices, inclusive government supports, and an annual evaluation tool. And we would do the same on a staff recruitment side of things. Then on the project stream side of things, for those initiatives, there's several different pillars here. So on the recruitment, training, and development programs for priority populations, we would look at some of those current recruitment and training and development programs that you have and make recommendations to move forward to support priority populations, connecting you to existing resources that are already in the system. One of the things that I think we need to recognize is that there's lots of great resources already in the sports system to support this work, and many great organizations also doing work. So thinking about how we connect you with some of those resources, but also to some of the organizations that can help create a more supportive, holistic approach. Second area is develop and implement a communications plan. And so we do communication and marketing reviews on a regular basis. And so we would do a review and recommendations to help support a communications plan. And then the next one is engaged in consultative needs-based program design, delivery, and evaluation to increase participation and retention of priority populations in sport. So again, a review of current efforts or ideas, review of what's happening across those priority populations to identify key opportunities and build relationships, and support for that relationship building, capacity building to support the work. That might include some training pieces. One of the things we've recognized is we've done audits and action plans with a number of sports across the system, is that there's an assumption in our sports system that we need to create new. And quite often there's actually programs already happening in communities that we just need to really connect to and be intentional about building the relationships around. And so appreciating that we need to take that approach of, instead of building something for, we're actually building with the communities that we want to work with. The last couple ones for this project stream are the development and or delivery of training. And so I've referenced some of the trainings that we have available, but certainly have ones available for each of the topics identified here, as well as many more. So creating a supportive training environment is something we can certainly help with. And then developing a gender equity or equity, diversity, inclusion monitoring system tool. We would suggest looking at the belonging metric as a tool that can really support this. We also recognize there's some other tools in the system right now, such as the culture audit tool and some other ones that are offered by companies outside of the sports system. And so if you've already got a tool you're using, we can also look at how we can support evolving that or connecting some of those data points. So I hope that provides you with quite a few ideas of ways that you can go in this work. And I'm going to stop our recording and stop sharing and then just open it up for questions and comments. And then I'll talk about some next steps.